The November sky over Washington, D.C. hung heavy, a vast canvas of gray that seemed to press down on the city. A sharp wind curled through the National Mall, stirring the flags that stood sentinel along the War Memorial Plaza. Their colors, red, white, and blue, snapped and fluttered, catching the muted light of a sun hidden behind clouds. The air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, mingling with the faint tang of distant rain. The plaza buzzed with quiet anticipation. A crowd gathered for Veterans Day, their faces a mosaic of pride, sorrow, and reverence. Soldiers in crisp uniforms stood at attention, their polished boots mirroring the stone beneath them. Politicians in tailored suits exchanged hushed words, their voices swallowed by the hum of the gathering. Families clutched flowers, their eyes tracing the names etched into the towering monuments, names that whispered of sacrifice, of lives cut short. At the edge of this sea of people, almost unseen, stood an old man, his silhouette frail but resolute, his presence a quiet defiance of time. Marcus Bell was 90, his skin etched with the deep lines of a life long lived, his eyes holding the weight of decades. He wore a navy blue suit, its fabric thin at the cuffs, its buttons dulled by years of careful use. A simple tie, knotted with trembling hands, hung against his chest. His cane, its wood worn smooth, anchored him to the earth, its tip sinking into the soft ground as he stood. He was alone. Apart from the crowd, his gaze fixed on the memorial's obelisk, where the names of the fallen gleamed faintly under the overcast sky. No one noticed him, not at first. He was just another figure, a shadow among hundreds, his story buried beneath the weight of years. But Marcus carried a truth no one knew, a memory he'd locked away so tightly it had become a part of him, inseparable from the rhythm of his heart. 70 years ago, Marcus had been a young man, his shoulders broad, his eyes bright with the fire of youth. He'd worn the uniform of the U.S. Army, its fabric starched, its weight a constant reminder of the world he'd entered. A black soldier in a segregated unit, he'd fought in the Second World War, his courage forged in the crucible of Europe's battlefields. In a forgotten corner of France, under a sky fractured by artillery fire, he'd acted without thought, driven by something deeper than fear or duty. 3 men, his brothers in arms, lay wounded in a ditch, their blood staining the earth, their gasps piercing the chaos. Bullets sang through the air, a deadly chorus. But Marcus moved. He dragged them to safety, one by one, his hands slick with their blood, his body trembling under the weight. He'd carried them through hell, his heart a drumbeat, his mind blank before the need to save them. They lived because of him. But when the war ended, when medals were pinned and heroes named, Marcus's story was erased. His bravery, undeniable, was dismissed because of the color of his skin. No citation, no ceremony, no honor, just silence. A silence that followed him back to Georgia, to a small house on a quiet street, where he buried his past and told himself it didn't matter, but it did. It always had. Now, standing in the shadow of the memorial, Marcus felt the ache of those years he hadn't wanted to come. The invitation had arrived weeks ago, a letter penned in neat script, signed by a Captain James Callahan, a name that meant nothing to him. The words were formal, polite, urging him to attend the Veterans Day ceremony in Washington. He'd held the letter over the trash, his hand hovering, but something stayed him. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or the weight of a hope he'd long since stopped naming. He'd boarded the bus from Georgia, his wheelchair left behind, his cane enough to carry him through the journey. Now, as the ceremony began, he stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart a quiet pulse, his eyes tracing the faces of those around him. The plaza was alive with movement. A general took the stage, his uniform heavy with ribbons, his voice steady as he spoke of valor and sacrifice. Names were called, medals presented, hands shaken. The crowd clapped, their applause a measured rhythm, rising and falling with each honoree. Marcus didn't clap. He didn't move. He stood still, his cane planted firmly, his eyes fixed on the men being celebrated. Men whose stories had been written into history while his had been erased. A young mother nearby lifted her son onto her shoulders, pointing at the soldiers, an elderly couple, their hands clasped, whispered memories to each other, their eyes glistening. A group of school children, their backpacks slung low, fidgeted as their teacher shushed them. Marcus felt like a specter, present but invisible. His life, a chapter no one had read. Captain James Callahan stood near the stage, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid. At 32, he was a man of quiet intensity, his career marked by discipline and a relentless curiosity. For years, he'd spent his nights in archives, sifting through crumbling records, chasing the stories of soldiers the world had overlooked. It had begun as a way to honor the past, a nod to the men who'd shaped his own path. But it had grown into something more, a mission to unearth the truths buried by time and prejudice. In a dusty basement, among boxes of forgotten files, he'd found Marcus's story, a single page, its ink faded, detailed the night in France, the 3 lives saved, the courage no one had acknowledged. James had read it under the flicker of a fluorescent bulb, his throat tightening, his hands trembling as he traced the words. He'd spent months tracking Marcus down, piecing together fragments of a life lived in obscurity. The letter he'd sent was a leap of faith, a hope that the old man would come. Now, as the ceremony neared its end, James felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't told Marcus the reason for the invitation. He hadn't dared. The general stepped back from the podium, his speech complete, the program drawing to a close. The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing louder, their bodies shifting as they prepared to leave. James felt a jolt of urgency. This was the moment. He moved forward, his boots clicking against the stage, and raised a hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The general paused, his brow furrowing, but he nodded, stepping aside. James took the podium, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. He looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of faces, young and old, soldiers and civilians, all watching him. He took a breath and began. "There's a story I need to tell," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying across the plaza. "It's about a soldier who, in the darkest hours of war, did what most of us could only imagine. He saved 3 men, carried them through a storm of bullets, and asked for nothing in return. His name was never called, his courage was never honored. But today, that changes." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on James, their breaths held. He paused, his gaze sweeping the sea of faces until it found Marcus, standing at the edge, his cane a quiet anchor. "That man," James said, his voice catching, "is Marcus Bell." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads turning, eyes searching. Marcus didn't move. His face was still, but his hands tightened around his cane, the wood creaking under his grip. James stepped down from the stage, his movements slow and deliberate, and began to walk toward him. The crowd parted, their whispers fading into a heavy silence. In James's hand was a small velvet box, its surface worn but polished, its contents a secret he'd carried for months. He stopped in front of Marcus, their eyes meeting, youth and age, present and past, soldier and soldier. The air between them seemed to hum, charged with the weight of what was to come. James knelt, one knee touching the cold ground. He opened the box, revealing a medal, its crimson ribbon folded neatly, its bronze star catching the faint light. It was the Bronze Star, the one Marcus should have received 70 years ago, the one denied him by a world that saw his skin before his sacrifice. James held it up, his hands steady, his voice soft but unwavering. "Mr. Bell," he said, "on behalf of a grateful nation, this is yours." He placed the medal in Marcus's trembling hands, its weight heavier than metal, heavier than time itself. Marcus stared at the medal, its edges blurring as his eyes filled. His lips parted, but no sound came at first. The years pressed against him, the nights spent wondering if anyone cared, the days spent silencing his own pain, the decades spent carrying a truth no one acknowledged. His fingers closed around the metal, its cool surface grounding him, anchoring him to this moment. Finally, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost, he said, "I waited my whole life just to know someone remembered." The words were fragile, raw, a confession carried across a lifetime. James stood, his eyes never leaving Marcus's, and raised his hand in a salute, a crisp, military salute, but something more, something that transcended protocol. It was a gesture that belonged to them alone, A bridge across generations. A promise kept. The crowd was silent, the stillness so profound it seemed the world had paused. Then, a single sob broke the quiet, sharp and unguarded. A woman in the front row pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. An old man, his own medals pinned to his jacket, stood slowly, his hands shaking as he clapped. Others followed, one by one, the sound building into a wave that rolled across the plaza. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled, their pens racing to capture a moment that defied words. A young girl, her pigtails swaying, tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering, "Why is everyone crying?" Her father, his own eyes wet, could only shake his head. Marcus didn't hear the applause. He didn't see the cameras. He looked at the medal, then up at the sky, where the clouds parted to reveal a sliver of blue. In that moment, he saw them. His brothers in arms, their faces young and fearless, their voices calling him across the years. He saw the fields of France, the smoke and fire, the weight of their bodies as he carried them to safety. He saw the boy he'd been, proud and terrified, believing in a world that could be better. A single tear traced the lines of his face, catching the light before it fell. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he felt whole. The ceremony ended, but the crowd lingered, their eyes following Marcus as he moved slowly through them. James at his side. They found a bench in a nearby park, its wood worn smooth by countless hands. The air was cooler now, the sun breaking through in soft, golden rays that dappled the ground. They sat in silence, the medal resting in Marcus's lap, his fingers tracing its edges as if to memorize its shape. The park was quiet, the distant hum of the city a faint echo. A squirrel darted across the paths, its tail twitching, and a pair of joggers passed, their footsteps rhythmic. But for Marcus and James, the world was small, contained in the space between them. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice low and steady, each word chosen with care. "I never needed this to know I was a soldier," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "I carried it here." He touched his chest, his hand lingering over his heart. "But today, I feel like a man." The words hung in the air, simple but profound, a truth distilled from a lifetime of silence. James listened, his heart full, his own eyes stinging. He thought of the archive, the nights spent chasing ghosts, the letter he'd written with trembling hands. He thought of his own service, the weight of his uniform, the pride he carried. But sitting here, beside a man who'd carried so much more, he felt small, humbled, honored to bear witness. They spoke little after that. Marcus told a story, halting at first, of a night in France when the stars had been so bright they seemed to mock the war below. He spoke of a friend, a boy from Alabama, who'd sung hymns to keep the fear at bay. He spoke of the letters he'd written to his mother, letters he'd never sent, their words too heavy for the page. James listened, his hands folded, his eyes tracing the lines of Marcus's face. He saw the young soldier in him, the man who'd run into danger, not for glory, but for love. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, a bond forged in a single moment that would endure. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, James helped Marcus to his wheelchair, the old man's strength fading with the day. They moved toward a waiting car, the crowd now gone, the plaza quiet once more. Marcus held the medal tightly, its ribbon catching the light, its weight a comfort against his palm. He didn't look back, but his face was calm, his eyes clear. James opened the car door, his movements gentle, and watched as Marcus settled inside. Their eyes met one last time, a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding. The car pulled away, its taillights fading into the dusk, leaving James alone on the path. James stood for a long moment, the wind tugging at his uniform, the weight of the day settling into his bones. He thought of Marcus's words, of the man who'd carried a war in his heart and never asked for recognition. He thought of the medal, not as medal and ribbon, but as a reckoning, a truth finally spoken. He thought of his own life, the years ahead, the soldiers he'd lead. He knew he'd carry this day with him always, a reminder of what it meant to serve. Not just a nation, but the people who built it, the stories that shaped it. Marcus rode in silence, the city blurring past the window. His hands rested in his lap, the metal warm against his skin. He didn't need it, Not really. He'd carried his courage through the years, through the silence, through the pain, through the nights when he wondered if anyone cared. But now, as the car wound through the streets, he felt something new, not pride, not relief, but peace. The peace of being seen, of being known, of being remembered. He thought of the men he'd saved, their faces vivid in his mind. He thought of the captain, young and earnest, who'd knelt before him. He thought of the crowd, their applause a fleeting echo, their tears a quiet gift. The sky darkened, and the first stars appeared.